I'm Sean Speer, the Project Director at the Ontario 360 Project here at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. As you may know, we've been releasing a series of papers over the past several weeks on key issues facing the Ontario government. And this week is no different. Today we released a paper co-authored by me and Kevin McCarthy on fiscal policy here in the province and what steps the government can take to both control the growth of new spending as well as improve the outcomes associated with current spending. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your contribution to the paper and for the discussion today. It seems like some of the insights and ideas in the paper are resonating with Ontario policymakers. Maybe just start with the case for reform, the need for action. Why are we focused on these issues? Why is the Ontario government focused on the question of budgeting, fiscal policy, and the processes that can underpin improved fiscal position here in Ontario?
Sure. Yeah, happy, Sean. It's been a pleasure being involved in this paper. I think obviously the fiscal situation in Ontario is very tight, and the Ontario government is committed to getting back on track, back to balance. And so it was my opportunity to kind of talk about our experiences in Ottawa in kind of similar circumstances. And so the paper really looked at two fronts, really. One, ways to kind of tackle existing spending, and two, kind of looking at how do you kind of combat new spending, or not combat new spending, but look at ways to kind of control those urges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. Last year, viewers will know that the 2019 budget was really zeroed in on fiscal savings, on deficit reduction, and the fall economic statement in November of 2019 seemed to be a bit of a pivot. That is to say, the hyper-focus on savings, on deficit reduction, has shifted to this question, as you say, of limiting the growth of new spending and improving the outcomes associated with current spending. You mentioned earlier, you mentioned in your comments, drawing on both our experiences as well as what the scholarship and research shows around successful fiscal reform agendas. Do you want to just talk a bit about, maybe to start with, the idea of strategic reviews, which is something that we were both part of when we were in Ottawa. Maybe just give viewers a sense of what the strategic review process was and how it could be something adopted here in the province of Ontario to better control the growth of new spending.
Yeah, sure. So the strategic reviews was a process that we were involved in. I was involved in working for Minister Flaherty. You were involved with working with Prime Minister Harper from 2007 to 2009, where we really looked at over a kind of 4-year span all government spending. Basically identified 25% of each departments. They were each tasked with identifying kind of the lowest performing 5%. So it was an exercise to really prioritize their own spending, kind of looking at what works, what didn't work, which programs may have been set up, years ago, but just weren't functioning anymore. And the goal was essentially to come back to the central agencies, Treasury Board, Finance in this case, and kind of offer up these 5% lowest performing. But the difference between kind of the DRAP process, which was later years, Deficit Reduction Action Plan, these weren't all savings that needed to be, they weren't just going back to the system, as it were. They actually, at the same time, could propose new funding, new priorities. And so in a sense, this was kind of fiscal recycling, if you would, of priorities. And the real benefit of that was kind of the system-wide buy-in. We talked about the difference between not just having the finance minister, treasury board minister, responsible for kind of getting back to balance or keeping spending in track, but really trying to have the whole system focused on that.
Yeah, it's such an important point. I mentioned earlier that the government seems to be going through a transition from hyper-focus on fiscal savings and deficit reduction to a greater focus on controlling the growth of new spending. And that's where we think the strategic review process in Ottawa may have some value for Ontario. As you say, the goal wasn't necessarily deficit reduction. It was to encourage ministers, departments to conduct a self-evaluation of their own spending and to identify within their respective departments 5% of spending that was low performing, low priority according to different tests. But then after having done so, they didn't just return those savings to the bottom line. They were able to put forward new ideas to recycle those savings back within their own departments. And one of the virtues of that was it created this prioritization exercise within the government. And secondly, it meant that by definition, spending growth was controlled, because for every new dollar in spending, we were encouraging departments to identify a dollar in savings.
Yes, exactly.
And as the Ford government, the Ontario government here, focuses on controlling the growth of spending, strategic reviews, as you say, may be a model that can help them control the growth of new spending. And as you said, in a bottom-up way. So rather than the Minister of Finance and the President of the Treasury Board saying, this program needs to be eliminated or this program needs to be reduced, you're actually empowering ministers in their respective ministries to conduct that work themselves.
Sorry. I was just going to say, I think there could be parallels. Our first budget, 2006, in Ottawa, we had a top-down kind of approach to finding savings. The Minister of the Treasury Board kind of identified with some work with the department, but really was kind of top-down. There was, I would say, a number of hiccups with a number of those savings proposals. We had to walk back and kind of reverse course on some of those. The 2007 strategic review process, much smoother, I think in large part because it was bottom up. They still had the 5% target, but they had the option of recycling. They had that incentive kind of built in to really take the program serious. And I think it worked much more effectively. There could be parallels with kind of the 2019 budget with the Ford government and kind of where we're kind of looking at now. So I think looking at something like a strategic review within the planning cycle that the government has here would be well worth it.
So that recommendation focuses on this question of controlling the growth of new spending. Let's spend the rest of our conversation just talking about the second step, the second part, which is improving outcomes associated with current spending or pre-existing spending. Viewers may know that the President of the Treasury Board recently unveiled what the government is calling a SMART initiatives. This is a focus on improving efficiency within government through various types of transformations, including the adoption of technology, centralization or consolidation of procurement functions, and so on. And really with the goal of trying to improve the outcomes associated with current spending. As part of the paper, we do two things in this regard. First, we draw on our own experiences, for better or for worse, in these types of initiatives. And then secondly, we really focus on what the research and literature says about the conditions or ingredients associated with these types of initiatives. Now, the paper identifies four of these of the conditions and ingredients that are really crucial to successful implementation of a smart government initiative. Do you mind just giving the viewers a sense of what those conditions and ingredients are?
Sure. Yeah, I think any of these kind of smart initiative or kind of smart government improving processes, improving services, I think everyone views these as kind of almost a no-brainer. Any government should be doing the common sense, but execution, I think, is key, as we learned in Ottawa, and kind of just, again, like you said, looking at our experience and also looking at the literature. The four key things we focused on, first would be kind of benchmarks, metrics, having kind of clear priorities of what does success look like and how are you prioritizing between different projects. Clearly important. That's also important, obviously, I think, in getting public buy-in and kind of support for kind of these transformational initiatives. Mm-hmm. Second would just be looking at project management capacity and technology capacity. You know, the ability to actually ensure you're making the right decisions. You have the ability to understand kind of the consequences of these decisions. Critical and key to success for any of these projects. Third, we're really looking at conservative cost saving estimates. So as I said earlier, and as we talk about in the paper, if you're looking at these projects only from the lens of cost savings, I think it's an error. And that's where you can get into dangers of kind of booking savings before you actually, again, have executed on the project, which then, compounds the problem. Not only do you not have those savings, you have to unwind what you've booked, and you've just made the problem much worse. So having conservative estimates, we even talk about in the paper, maybe having a fund, right, to incentivize kind of departments or ministries to kind of take on some of these projects. Because some of these, let's be honest, they take an initial investment, right? The modernization, digitization, the savings are in the long term. The outcomes are better for Ontarians, but there is some upfront costs. And the last one, as we talked about today, is around cybersecurity risk mitigation, which is something as 10 years ago, wasn't really even on our radar, but looking at the literature, it's obviously a key kind of critical component. Any of these kind of initiatives, programs, and that if you have a major cybersecurity risk, data breach, you're going to lose not only the momentum on the project, but kind of public support, anything like that. So having a key risk management initiative around any of these projects is critical.
Yeah, those are important observations. And if the Ford government, as it's evaluating different initiatives, different projects, as part of this smart government agenda, if it's applying these 4 lenses, we'll hopefully minimize the risks for cost overruns or delays or other problems, and tilt the projects in the direction of success. Maybe just one thing though before we transition to the final recommendation, or the final area of focus that I want to spend a bit of time on. It's just worth emphasizing that notwithstanding what we've just discussed, the government needs to recognize, and Ontarians need to recognize, that an initiative like this isn't going to have a 100% success record. Right. Companies that undertake these types of initiatives don't tend to have 100% success records when you're involving multiple systems and legacy systems and the adoption of new technology and so on. Do you want to just talk a bit about the political economy of these types of initiatives and what steps maybe the government can take to try to manage the challenges and risks associated with them? Because I think you're so correct to say if these aren't properly managed, public support will be diminished, and momentum can become stalled. So, do you have any insights or thoughts about what the government can do to help the public understand what's happening, and then secondly to give the public a sense of where these initiatives are succeeding and where there are challenges? Yeah,
so we talk about in the paper the need for kind of consistent or regular reporting on the initiative. So I think communication is key, and in line with the principles that we're talking, the 4 principles we're really talking about. So potentially a regular update with the fall economic statement, or maybe even quarterly updates on these smart initiatives, I think, to really communicate, first of all, the value of kind of why they're doing this, what's the improvements, and tell a story, right, to explain how this is going to be better for Ontarians. But I think also to kind of lay the groundwork for a potential failure, and it doesn't have to be an epic failure,
a spectacular failure.
But just that this project we looked at, it sort of made sense at the time. We thought we'd have this savings and that, but for whatever reason, cost overruns, kind of delays, that again, you're not going to bat 1,000 in doing this. So I think regular communication around kind of the story, the narrative, what you're trying to do for Ontarians is key, and kind of communicating that. Also, I think in that communication, the cost savings shouldn't be front and center. Yes. That's a kind of secondary benefit to these measures. It's really about making, I think, lives better for Ontarians, kind of services better for Ontarians, kind of making government run more efficiently, using the tools at our disposal in terms of digital.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and I think good advice for a government that may at times find it difficult to resist the temptation not to focus on savings, particularly given its deficit position. Let's just talk about the final area of focus, which, as viewers may know, has been consistent with some of the other papers that we released in the series. The province is increasingly marked by regional economic disparity, and yet so much of government functions reside here in Toronto, our most dynamic city, the place responsible for north of 75% of all job creation over the past decade. Yeah. So the paper talks about the potential for decentralizing some government functions, both to achieve efficiencies, given high real estate prices and costs, labor costs here in Toronto, but also with the potential to catalyze economic activity in rural and economically distressed parts of Ontario. It sounds like a slam dunk, but I think your research finds that, well, it's an area that the government ought to pursue. Yeah. It needs to do so in a clear-eyed way, that there are some risks associated with a decentralization initiative. Can you just talk a bit about what the literature tells us, and maybe give viewers a sense of the experience in the United Kingdom, which has had some success at this type of decentralization agenda?
Sure, yeah. So the Brookings Institute just released a paper on this very topic, and they kind of highlight, as you mentioned, the kind of the pros or the benefits that could come from this in terms of helping regionally distressed areas, but also cost efficiencies. But they kind of flag a few issues. One of which is, I call it the potential Amazon effect, where you have these different regions, mayors, and that lobbying for these jobs to come. And if the process becomes too politicized, that's a real danger. Yes. Because literature does look at, you need to have synergies for the kind of the HR, kind of the human resources capacity of the region, and also kind of the functions that are coming in there. So that looking at the UK example in 2004, England looked at kind of making changes around kind of with the goal of moving 20,000 jobs out of Greater London. For the same reasons that we face here in Toronto. Real estate in London is obviously much more expensive than other areas of the country. Also kind of regionally distressed areas could benefit from those jobs. And the London example, I think, is one that the Ontario government should look at if they're looking to do this, because it was a long-term process. By making it kind of a longer-term, larger kind of focus and really looking for those synergies, I think they avoided a number of the political dangers of kind of a program like this. And the research found that not only did they exceeded the 20,000 target, 25,000 jobs were moved out of Greater London. And the follow-up research is that those jobs have not only benefited the regions, but the country as a whole. So I think it's a good model for Ontario to look at, but there are definitely dangers in going down that path.
Well, that's great, and certainly an area where there seems to be linkage to a couple priorities for the Ontario government, both the emphasis on government efficiency, but also I think increasing awareness and focus on this question of regional economic disparity. Well, thank you for your contribution. I think these issues are obviously ongoing here in the province, but I think if the Ontario government moves forward on some of the insights and recommendations of the paper, both with respect to controlling or limiting the growth of new spending, and secondly, improving the outcomes associated with current spending, it will continue to make progress on its fiscal objectives. But I think, as you say here in both and in your presentation, ultimately provide better governance and better services for Ontario. And I think if there's one major takeaway, it's that second priority needs to be as top of mind as the first one. And I think if policymakers are reading your paper, they will have a blueprint to move in that direction. So thank you.
That's great.
Thank you for your contribution, and thank you for your ongoing interest and support for the Ontario 360 project. Kevin's paper today wraps up our set of papers in 2019, but we will be back in early 2020 with the next round of papers covering issues as wide-ranging as intergovernmental financing questions between the provincial government and municipalities to foreign credential recognition and better integrating new Ontarians into our economy, and even getting at improvements in our skilled trades or apprenticeship programs. Thank you so much for your interest in the Ontario 360 project and our efforts to try to spark a two-way conversation between policy experts and Ontario policymakers. It's been an exciting series thus far, and we look forward to continuing the conversation in the new year. Thank you so much.